So over on Prohibition Theology on TikTok, I suggested that I would take us through some of these texts that are typically used by these strange second coming theologies that have developed over the last couple of centuries. I say strange because it's not like the whole world believes those things or thinks that these texts are about that. It's mostly actually situated in the United States, as well as in places where the United States has sent missionaries. Of course, you also find it to some degree in the United Kingdom and in pockets of other countries around the world, but by and large, it's a very much a non-biblical phenomenon that came much later. So, what then are these texts actually about? This is what we're going to be doing here. So I'm going to remove myself from this in a minute and just talk us through the text, and it's going to be like a speed kind of exegesis, speed interpretation sort of thing. If you wanted the full verse by verse version, that's available somewhere else too, but that's on Warehouse Theology. We don't need that right now, okay? So the situation is they're coming out of the temple here. A few minutes later, they're outside or opposite the temple down there. Now, if we were actual readers or hearers, in those days mostly hearers, of Mark's Gospel, we would know a lot of stuff that I'm implying here, and I'll point it out in a minute, that you don't see in this chapter, but you see it in the previous 12 chapters. That's important context. This is why we cannot just take a text out of the middle of a gospel or any text for that matter and just pretend that it's worth interpreting it by itself. It isn't. We're going to slaughter it. Let's not do that. All right, so they're coming out of the temple, and we know by now, as readers or hearers of Mark's Gospel, that that is bad news when they're near the temple, in the sense that whenever Jesus is near the temple, there's going to be conflict. Whenever he's near a synagogue, there's going to be conflict. Synagogues are like mini temples minus the sacrifices. They're like signposts to the temple. The thing that connects them all is that, not Jesus, but the synagogue and the temple, is that they work with an understanding of holiness that is ritually based, and Jesus throws that out. He does it very clearly in Mark chapter 7 about the food laws, for instance. What goes into the mouth is not the problem, it's what comes out. So in one sweep, he redefines holiness in relational terms as opposed to ritual ones. And if that is the case, it's going to be, if that's how it's going to be, then that means there's no place for the temple anymore, or for the synagogue, especially since those are places of the religious establishment that's based on that sort of understanding of holiness, and that's kind of bossing the people around a lot. You see that with the Pharisees, who are attached to synagogues typically. Okay, so now here Jesus pronounces judgment on the temple. So the disciples ask one of their silly questions, and almost everything they say and almost everything they do in Mark's Gospel and same in Luke's Gospel, and even to some extent in Matthew, is not particularly clever or intelligent, and that's putting it mildly. They fail a lot of the time, and don't shoot the messenger. I mean, I didn't write the text, or the texts plural. Why are they failing so much? Because they don't want to accept that the one they've chosen to follow and devote their life to, and who carries Israel's hopes on his shoulders, that he would actually bypass and do away with the temple. And so they're constantly getting themselves into trouble with him for that reason. And here's one of those examples, and they say a silly thing up here. They say, hey, look, what large stones and large buildings. It's like going to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. and saying, whoa, look at that, how large it is, and it looks like a Capitol building. Well, duh. But it's a classic disciple question. And again, don't shoot the messenger. It's just funny to me how we tend to kind of treat these guys as venerable, and the text, the actual text that we have, are not interested in that. They're interested in showing how they have their own agenda, which is very different from Jesus's. So if you go into a cathedral and there's St. Peter hovering above you, well, you may want to think about that. Are you going to go with that understanding of the disciples as saints, or are you going to go with the understanding of the New Testament? Choices, right? Okay, so then after asking this question, Jesus pronounces judgment on the temple. Not one stone will be left upon another; all will be thrown down. Utter judgment. He's not kidding. He's taking on the temple directly. And that, of course, gets you crucified ultimately. So when they're sitting across from the temple, opposite the temple in the Mount of Olives, they move, these four guys here then move to the next level of questioning Jesus, whether he's really thought this whole thing through about getting rid of the temple. So they ask him privately. They don't want others to hear this. This is rather delicate, isn't it, and awkward and whatnot. And so they ask a question, double question. I want you to pay attention to it pretty closely, please. The double question is, tell us, when will this be? And then the second part, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished? Okay, this is important because later in this chapter, Jesus answers that set of a double question. And that together is like a sort of parenthesis around this chapter. The reason this is important is there's no indication here that this chapter is about anything other than the destruction that Jesus pronounces on the temple. And by the way, he had done it before. He had done it before symbolically in chapter 11 with that fig tree that he treats as if it were the temple, and he pronounces judgment on it, and the next day they walk past it and it's withered. So it's not like this comes out of nowhere. The disciples definitely don't want to hear any of this. But from Jesus' perspective, it doesn't come out of nowhere at all. It completely fits the narrative of Mark's gospel. And nothing so far in this gospel has been about end of the world or Jesus coming in midair or anything like that. You know, like in those Tim LaHaye second coming theologies. All right, so then he began to say to them, so he starts a teaching kind of thing, which is really rare in Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel usually tells us that he taught them, but it doesn't tell us what he taught. Well, in this case, it does. This is very focused here. Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he. I am he what? Well, I am the Messiah, the figure that Israel is waiting for that will sort of carry Israel's hopes on his shoulders. By the way, there were different messianic hopes around in the first century. There were communities that thought there might be two messiahs, you know, one more royal or kingly and the other one more priestly. And there were some that thought, no, it's just going to be a king like David, and others that thought, no, it's just going to be some sort of high priest, and so on. And sure enough, we know that there were many that used that name and said, I am the one, in the first century. And there's some really sad stories or stories of hubris. There's this one dude who came along and said, you're going to be able to tell that I'm the one by coming with me into the mountains, and I'm going to find Noah's Ark. So they go up there, and he strikes out Noah's Ark. So that's the end of him. And another dude said, come with me, I'm going to take you to the river Jordan, and like Moses, I'm going to part the waters. And I guess he waved his arm and nothing happened, so that was the end of that. So that's a little sad. But there you go. So my point is, this kind of stuff here has first century written all over it. And then he says, when you hear of wars, this is up here now, there, and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed, this must take place, but the end is still to come. It's a classic motif that we have in the Gospels in numerous places. One example I could give you is Luke 17, which talks about the days, plural, and then the day at the end, the culmination, and it's war. This is war language, right? You have a war, and the war culminates eventually. This is all first century. When you hear those wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed, this must take place, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation. Who do you think that is? That's Israel and Rome. And it doesn't matter which way around this goes, whether Israel provokes Rome so much that Rome will attack, or whether Rome randomly attacks. Many people in Israel at the time thought it is going to come to this, and then God will defend Israel, and Israel will rise up against the mighty, oppressive empire. The kingdom of God here against the kingdom of darkness, which is the Romans. And there'll be earthquakes, and we actually have reports of earthquakes in the first century. That's not super important for right here, but thought I'd throw it in. There's a Qumran community, and archaeology has shown us that their life was disrupted, and they had to leave the communities where they withdrew. That was another severe holiness community. They had to get out of there at some point because the place got partially destroyed by an earthquake. There will be famines. Read Acts. There are famines in the first century. Again, it's not the main focus here, but my point is this has first century written all over it. Okay, let's move on a little bit here. So then it goes on with advice in terms of how to react once they get handed over to councils. That would be the ruling councils, which of course is run by holiness people. And they don't measure up, at least Jesus doesn't measure up to that. So to the extent that his disciples are going to keep following him, they're going to suffer his fate in the sense of being judged by the authorities and the institution. And he says you'll be beaten in the synagogues, and you'll stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. Now, if you read Acts, which is volume 2 of Luke's Gospel, you see Paul, for instance, precisely in this kind of situation. This is, again, all first century stuff. And still no indication whatsoever that this is about anything later, end of the world, or anything like that. And then it says, and the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. Does that mean like every single nation on earth? No, the point is here, just like we had further up, where they rise kingdom against kingdom. Here, this is the context, right? So this is not about literally the whole world needing to be evangelized or anything like this down here. This is about the fact that the good news must not be sort of bottled up within Israel in the form of Jesus and hopefully his disciples, but rather it must be sort of uncorked. It must get out there, because remember, that is what the Abraham covenant, which I sometimes call Project Humanity, God's Project Humanity, that is what the Abraham covenant is about. Jesus is about to fulfill that, and that covenant is about God committing to letting blessings flow into the world and using Israel. And Jesus says the question is, what kind of Israel? Which Israel? The institutional one that is based on ritual holiness, or the relational one that I'm setting up here? So that's the context for all of this. So when people take something like this here about, don't worry, the Holy Spirit will give you the words, and they think it's about them, that's just so trivial. No, it's not about them. It's about the first century. It's about Jesus and his disciples and the things that Acts talks about. And it's so weird how every generation says, it's about us, it's about us, it's about us. We're such narcissists, and every generation thinks the end is near, and they mean the end of the world, and then they use texts like this, and it gets so old. Anyway, brother will betray brother to death, a father his child, children against parents have them put to death. Verse 12 here, this is very much first century stuff. We know this happened then, not only then, but especially then, in the sense of people having to ask this Israel question inside a family, and some come down on the side of the status quo and the institutional ritualistic understanding of Israel, with that particular understanding of ritual holiness and priests and the high priest and sacrifices and temple courts and Jerusalem as the sort of eternal city of God. And did I mention pilgrimages, Sabbaths, food laws, circumcision, you name it, all that ritual stuff for which Jesus has zero patience, and we saw that at the beginning of this chapter, how he pronounces that whole thing null and void. At least to the extent that it's embodied in the temple, and the temple is everything in Israel. The temple embodies the worldview of Israel, certainly at the time, and in somewhat different ways still to this day. And then he says, you'll be hated because of me and my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. What end? Well, the end that we saw up here, because right here we have the end as well. The end of that period of war. So the culmination. So if you endure through that war to the end of that war, you're in good shape, is what he is saying. This is first century all the way. So this is where it's starting to get juicy, and this is why a lot of people use this text supposedly for end of the world stuff. But I want you to consider something. Practically speaking, does any of this stuff matter if we're talking about the end of the world? I mean, look at this. He says when the, oops, I'm moving the text here, when the desolating sacrilege is set up where it ought not to be. And in Israel, that is a very clear indication. We know that from the book of Maccabees, that refers to the temple when the temple was desecrated by a pagan power in 167 BC. So basically, he's saying when that kind of desecration happens again, I moved it again, when that happens again up here, let the reader understand that that's kind of massive. This is the writer of the gospel saying, take real good notice of this. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Does that make sense if it's the end of the world? The one on the housetop must not go down or enter the house, take anything away. Does that make sense if it's the end of the world? The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Does that make sense if it's end of the world? Of course not. None of this stuff makes sense on that assumption. Does it make sense in a first century context where the Roman army is advancing on Jerusalem, and which, by the way, happened at the end of the Jewish War? So the Jewish War is mostly from AD 66 to 70, so it's about 40 years after Jesus, give or take, because Jesus' ministry was between 27 and 30. So it's about 40 years later. This all makes great sense in that context. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing infants in those days. Why? Because they will have to flee from the Roman army. And he says, pray that it may not be in winter. Even now, right now, where Russia is threatening the Ukraine, and there's this question of whether this might happen during winter or not, and many there being worried about it. This all makes complete sense in that kind of context. And then he says, in those days there will be suffering such as has not been seen from the beginning of creation that God created until now. No, and never will be. Now, people take this kind of stuff literally, but the thing is, we have plenty of examples of this sort of language to express by emphasis the magnitude of what we're talking about. This is how you express magnitude, and we use language like this too, and not just them at the time when the Berlin Wall came down and Germany was reunified in 1989. There were newspaper headlines that basically used sort of end of the world language. It's like, this is the end of the world, meaning this is the end of the world as we know it. Everything will be different from now on. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So we know how language works, and they knew how language works. You can use this, and we have evidence of this in the Bible, outside of the Bible. This is not literal stuff here. This shows the enormity of what is going on. Okay, so, and then it goes on. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, where are we? Right here. No one would be saved. What days? The war, the Jewish war, because the Romans would finish off every last part of Israel. And there's this fortress in the 70s, so after most of the war was over and some Jews held out in Masada, a very heroic kind of story, but in the end, the Romans got to them. Well, the Jews took it in their own hands to cut this short. But this language, all I'm saying is, makes complete sense in the first century, and even more importantly, there is nothing here, absolutely nothing, that says that the stage has moved on to the world or end of the world or anything like that. And then again, like we had before, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or look there, do not believe it. I told you already there were a bunch of people who did this, like the dude who wanted to part the waters of Jordan and so on. False messiahs and prophets will appear, produce signs, omens to lead astray if possible. The elect. What does the elect mean? The elect is classic language in the New Testament and in the Old, for that matter, for what's called the remnant. And those are the people who are not saying we are fine because we're Israelites. No, these are the people who who are actually committed to that relationship with God. And this is the word used for that. And of course, later theology took it out of context and used it individualistically, which they would never have done in the first century, and says this is about, Mr. Jones goes to heaven and Mrs. Jones to hell or something like that. That kind of individualistic thing comes out of the last few hundred centuries, out of the European Enlightenment especially, and to some extent a little bit before that too, but it certainly is not a biblical understanding. You can translate this as remnant. It's like the real deal, because there was always an understanding that even in Israel, people weren't cool or safe or whatever because they were Jews. They were cool or safe because they committed to God. Be alert, I've already told you everything. So this is where it gets really juicy. Mark 13, 24 through 27. And I asked you over on TikTok to find Old Testament texts that are being used in this chapter. And two of them are right here. So what we have in 24 and 25 is language that comes straight out of the book of Isaiah. And then in 26 and 27, especially 26, we have language that comes straight out of Daniel 7. And when you know that Jesus is deliberately couching his words in language from the Old Testament, in a narrative society like that, that means undoubtedly you have to go there. You have to understand what this is about in the original context and then see the connections. So let's do that in 24 and 25. So this comes from Isaiah. And what is Isaiah about? Isaiah is about the fact that Israel is in real trouble vis-a-vis its enemies and is in captivity and has to find a way out. And it talks about that particular context in this kind of language. We call this apocalyptic language. The language sounds like if it's about another world somewhere, but that's how metaphor works. Metaphor is a way of talking about something by actually talking about something else and letting people make the connection. That is essentially a metaphor. That's the opposite of something literal. And that is what's happening here. In Isaiah, this is undoubtedly not literal. It is metaphorical. There used to be the song by R.E.M. called "It's the End of the World as We Know It." I think goes on and "We Feel Fine" or something like that. You probably know. And that is what we have here. It's a metaphorical end of the world. The language from Isaiah makes that super clear. There is no way we can literalize this. It would be like a kind of slap in the face of Jesus, interpretively speaking, to say that this is about a literal end of the world and literal stars falling from heaven and so on. And remember, if that were the case, then it wouldn't matter if you're pregnant or not. It wouldn't matter if it's winter. It wouldn't matter whether you go back into the house to retrieve your coat or you flee into the mountains of Judea. None of that would actually matter. Listen, people, this is super, super clear. None of this has anything to do with end of the world. There is no excuse when charlatans like Tim LaHaye and about 80-90% at excuse me, at least of TV preachers talk this kind of utter nonsense. Based on slaughtering the biblical text, it just kind of makes you angry. It's also deeply embarrassing. So please don't embarrass yourself by subscribing to this kind of stuff. What about verses 26 and 27? Comes from Daniel 7. Now the Son of Man is defined in Daniel 7 3 times. Read it for yourselves. As the saints, plural. That's another word for remnant. Remember that word remnant I used earlier? That's sort of the real deal, the Israelites who are really committed, and non-Israelites who are really committed to God, for that matter. That is what Son of Man represents in Daniel 7. And coming in clouds, coming where? That's the big question. Remember, in Second Coming theology, it's a coming to earth from somewhere. That is not at all what Daniel 7 is talking about. What Daniel 7 is talking about is the opposite. It's a coming into the presence of God. Read it. I'm not making this up. Read it. And if you have a study Bible that puts a comment in there on Daniel 7 and says this is about the second coming, throw it away. That's ridiculous. This is how study Bibles can be so pernicious and completely lead you astray. And remember how this text of all texts here in Mark 13 advises people not to be led astray. Okay, so in Daniel 7, this is about the remnant, and that's why Jesus calls himself, this is his preferred self-title, Son of Man. That means he is taking the role of the remnant. Let's put it differently. He redefines what it actually means to be remnant, what it means to be the real deal, what it means to be the real people of God. And that people will be exalted in the sense of appearing metaphorically in the presence of God, and that is what coming in the clouds means. It's not a coming to earth, it's the opposite. It's an exaltation, even though it's metaphorical. And it is powerful and glorious. He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds. Remember how Mark 13 talks about the good news needs to be uncorked and flow basically to the nations, and not just be within a small section of Israel. And that's exactly what we have here. All of this, friends, is a no-brainer. Okay, so now we're at verse 28, and I want you to notice something. It talks about a fig tree, and Jesus had already been cursing the fig tree in chapter 11 of the same gospel. And guess what? That was a symbol of the temple. It's very clear if you look at the context of that in chapter 11. And so this is still part of the same motif, still part of the same thing, nothing to do with end of the world or anything like that. And it says, when its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So this is like the successive piece after the temple. This is, if you will, the new temple. And you know how Paul takes this up and develops it and basically says, we, the people, are the people of God, and we are the temple of God. We don't need a physical temple. And then he says, when you see these things taking place, and look at this right here, when you see these things taking place, and there you realize, hey, that was the question that started this whole thing by the disciples. When will these things take place? And now he's finally coming around and he's saying, when these things take place, you know that he is near at the very gate. So when the handing on of the baton from the temple as is to this newly conceived relational temple, when that happens, that is when he is near. That is the coming into the presence of God. Remember that from Daniel 7? We talked about that a minute ago. That is when that happens. And now look at verse 30, and this has thrown a lot of people. And this is the second part of the answer to the disciples' question. When will it happen? They wanted to know, what will be the sign? And he said, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. You see, this is where specifically evangelicals have such, and Pentecostals have such a sort of an interpretive death wish. They say, it doesn't really mean this generation. It means the generation that happens to be around whenever this happens. I'm sorry, that is silly. That's like saying, if I said to you, let's meet at McDonald's on Wednesday at 10 o'clock, and then you show up on Wednesday at 10 o'clock, and I don't, and then you ask later, what happened? Why didn't you come? And I say, I didn't mean that Wednesday. I meant the Wednesday at 10 o'clock, whenever we happen to run into each other at McDonald's. That's just silly. Just silly. But the thing that really got people kind of confused is verse 31, heaven and earth will pass away, my words will not pass away. And some have said, there you go, heaven and earth will pass away, we have the end of the world right here. Oh well. Hey, do you guys we all know the phrase "pigs fly," and I know in England there used to be this phrase. It's a little quaint, a little old world, but there used to be this phrase, "I'll eat my hat," and in Germany, for some reason, the saying goes, "I'll eat a broomstick." None of those things mean that you will literally do that. I mean, the point of saying pigs fly is not that pigs literally fly, but that they do not fly. And just as much as they do not fly, something is not going to happen. That's what we mean when we say pigs fly. The same thing is happening here. Heaven and earth will pass away, meaning it will actually not, just like pigs fly, but my words will not pass away. The point of this is to say that if even heaven and earth do not pass away, how much less will my words pass away? Which, of course, is what the disciples wanted. They wanted his words to be not true, his words to pass away. Do you see what is happening rhetorically here? We do this in every culture, and they did it too. And for someone to come along and make this literal is just nuts. And then it says about the day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And again, people take that as being about the end of the world. But guess what? He already said up here, it won't happen more than a generation removed. So we know that. We just don't know the hour, the day or the hour. It all makes sense. It all comes together. So there you go. Do we need to look at anything else? Well, down here is the language of someone going away and then coming back. What is this referring to? When someone goes away and comes back and finds some people asleep and says, stay awake, well, it obviously refers to the disciples who did not stay awake a chapter later when Jesus was arrested. But more widely, what this refers to is the conviction in Israel at the time that God had left them temporarily. There hadn't been any prophets for a long time, for a few hundred years, until John the Baptist finally appeared. And God had kind of left Israel sort of in the lurch and would finally come back. And that is how this works. What Jesus is basically saying, when these things happen that I talked about here, the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple, for goodness sakes, don't think that this is some sort of, accident of history. No, this is the God of Israel returning in power and glory. Daniel 7, remember that, returning and taking care of judgment imposed on or inflicted on a system that is oppressive and corrupt. The temple was extremely corrupt by the first century. I could tell you stories about that. You can read about it in Josephus. And so he's basically saying, when this happens, don't think that this is an accident of history. This is nothing less than God's judgment. All that is to say, in summary, the entire chapter is completely and entirely about the first century, and that's that.